So, hi, Larry Attree. You are the head of global policy and advocacy at one of the organizations closest to my heart, Saferworld, which I'm also proud to be associated with. You have worked over 16 years in this field for various organizations. You have a long list of assets in your CV, and what I wanted to speak with you today is the problem we have in Sweden of seeing the whole picture, so to say. We just had a big news item today on the Swedish media about the new Aid Watch report, which Concord has put out, expressing worries about how development aid is being used for purposes which are not in line with what one would want to see in view of the 2030 agenda. And of course, this is nothing new for you. You have worked on this topic for a very long time. I've also been involved in it, maybe more on the institutional side. On the EU side, since 9/11, basically, I have followed this. I've also myself worked in Africa. I started my work as a diplomat in Angola in the very early days. So you've been always, from my perspective, I've always been there trying to see how can we make a difference to the better, or are we actually doing things to the worse? And you have just tweeted out a very interesting picture the other day about the vicious circle, which I suppose you want to address today. But maybe you would want to say first a little bit about yourself and about Saferworld, and why Saferworld is particularly well placed to have a view on these issues.
Well, thanks very much for the opportunity to talk about these issues, which are amongst the most pressing issues facing Europe and countries like Sweden around the world. Myself, as you say, I've been working at Saferworld on and off for 16 years. We're a non-profit think and do tank that works to promote peace around the world. Most of that work, maybe 85%, is work with communities towards addressing security problems and conflict drivers in conflict zones. But we also work to encourage better engagement to address instability in just and lasting ways by international players. And we know that's very necessary if we're going to see lasting shared security around the world.
And you're actually out there, aren't you? I mean, as an organization, you're out in the field in some of the most difficult circumstances. So it's for you extremely important that you are perceived as a good force, so to say, for peace and conflict resolution.
Yes, that's right. So we began as an organization that was encouraging people to work towards better arms controls around the world, to stop arms flowing into conflict zones. And from there, we got more and more involved in what people are actually doing with the weapons on the ground. So today, we work in contexts like Somalia and South Sudan and Yemen, where obviously the people living in those countries are beset by deep problems of instability, fragile institutions, and we both try and work directly with people to solve the challenges that underpin their security problems, and try and think structurally, systemically, how do we fix these kind of decades-old problems of conflict in these contexts, which involves thinking through the politics of what's going on, why elites are behaving the way they do to consolidate power and wealth, and using violence often as a tool to do that. So we're trying to make a practical difference and trying to connect what we've seen and worked for on the ground with the changes that are needed also from international players who want to be friends of these kind of countries.
Yeah, so obviously you are very exposed, and you have many people who are doing a fantastic job out there in very difficult circumstances. And But still, you are not just only looking at the thing, so to say, locally, but you have a very strong local engagement, but in your advocacy you're also proposing a more holistic perspective on things.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we've seen over the last few years not just a rise in the number of conflicts taking place around the world, but also, you know, the analysis is that the places where it's proving hard, civil conflicts which are intensely internationalized in terms of external players having interests at play there, whether it's in countering terrorism, countering what's seen as irregular migration, whether it's trade relations with some of the actors involved in those conflicts. And you can't necessarily solve those kind of conflicts and those kind of problems by only looking locally. You have to be looking for solutions that are grounded in what people see as the right answers and the things that are important for their well-being. But you have to be pressing the international players to respect those things. And so, yes, we are increasingly trying to bring that people's perspective and a civil society perspective to international policy debates about conflict and instability.
Before we go into the more precise, what you call the vicious circle about European migration control, conflict and displacement, and other, so to say, bad processes in terms of development assistance, security-related assistance, and what that means for Europe, domestic policy, and so on. Can I have a word with you about the concept of security itself? Because I have a background from the OSCE, for instance, where we worked already from the 70s with a comprehensive concept of security, which included human rights, the rule of law, democracy from 1990 and onwards. And this was very much in the East-West dimension, of course, looking at creating a new framework for cooperation and security and cooperation in Europe. But that has also then very much influenced the debate inside the EU, particularly when we started after 9/11 to look at how to create a comprehensive security perspective, integrated solutions, and of course being alerted very early to the problem of radicalization, that what you do wrong in the field might actually radicalize people to become terrorism, radicalize into to terrorism, but basically still continuing to try to develop. Also the UK pushing for an integrated approach with everything put basically in the framework of a security perspective. And you have been fairly critical towards some of this work, haven't you?
We're probably on the same page in the sense of this understanding of security as something which is inextricable from people's security, human security, and human rights. So all around the world, we have studied the factors that lastingly peaceful societies have in common. And I think they boil down to 5 things. They work to reduce violence and ensure the public feels safe. They ensure fair access to justice, livelihoods, resources, and services. They enable voice and participation in decision-making and constructive resolution of grievances. They have lower levels of corruption and bribery. And they're not so exposed to external stresses, so things like flows of arms, drugs, conflict commodities, illicit finance. So when people sort of strategize for the achievement of security, my main questions always come back to whether they are advancing progress towards those 5 kind of core elements, or whether they're trying to take shortcuts which potentially undermine them. And I think what we've seen in recent years, in the name of trying to contain unwanted migration, in trying to stave off the risk of terror attacks from rebel movements with their roots in conflict settings, in terms of sort of trying to maintain strong relationship with partners that are seen as wealthy and maybe as strategic partners, the likes of Saudi Arabia, for example, that people have tried to take these shortcuts towards security in ways that risk undermining those 5 conditions, even though we have all the evidence about how important they can be in preventing conflict. And the observation from the research that we've done, which is now quite an extensive body of research over the years, is that these shortcuts tend not to work, and that we are seeing a clearer and clearer picture that if you're prepared to try and trade off quick gains in counterterrorism or migration control against human security and human rights, that over time the problems and threats are going to get worse. And so a lot of our policy work is about trying to bring those messages home and strategize with policymakers on what their options really are if they want lasting solutions to their security challenges.
Reminds me about a problem which I met when I was in the EU structures, and we had quite a number of crisis situations during the years when I worked there from 1996 to 2011. And that is that when you had a crisis, people would say very loudly that never again, now we must do everything immediately to avoid that this happens again, and then you would mobilize a lot of political will and possibly also money, and then you would basically shout at the bureaucrats to see to it that this money is dispersed in new programs as quickly as possible. And what I found when I wrote my book about EU and security in 2015 is that much of that work went out without a serious impact assessment ex ante, as we say, just trying to figure out how will this work in practice and what will be the real sustainable effects, sustained effects of that work. So that we have, of course, after 9/11, we have it in the interventions in Iraq, in Afghanistan and other places. But we also have it in general counterterrorism work. And the question is whether we also have it in migration controls now.
Well, I think, that's a very timely question to be posing, because we are right now in a period where we've seen a sort of uptick and spreading out of what we've sort of called the European border security model, which has been evolving, over the last 21 years since the Council's high-level working group on asylum and migration set up in 1998, through the Seville Summit, through the formation of the European Border Agency, Frontex, through the global approach to migration in 2005, through the Rabat process, up to things like the Khartoum process, the European Agenda on Migration and its 4 pillars, the Valletta Agreement, the EU Emergency Trust Fund for Africa. And through all these agreements, you see a thread of emphasis on things like safe legal movement of migrants, protection, rights, development, but also a sort of growth in steadily more focus on hard security solutions outside EU borders to deal with increasingly frequent migratory crises. And as we look forward at this juncture, we're set to see a big hike in funding for migration and border controls under the EU's new multi-annual financial framework. also the proposal for a large European peace facility that could be worth 10.5 billion euros to expand, train and equip assistance to EU partners. And other changes in common security and defence policy missions, so that they increasingly take on counter-migration roles. So the point that you make about these increased investments being very cognizant of the track record of European engagement, and we're not just talking about assessing whether they've cut migrant arrivals, but also their impacts on repression and instability in Europe's neighbourhood. It's very important that that track record is understood and factored into the way forward by European governments and decision makers, because there are clear risks on doubling down on an approach which could prove counterproductive, more repression, more conflict, and yes, more displacement and possibly more migration over the long term. If that is not what Europe wants, then it needs to look at the evidence of what does and doesn't work.
What I find when I talk to different types of people about the problems that they see, in Sweden, I can refer to a debate that was on the Swedish television the other day about what to do to manage the rise of difficult regions and parts of cities in Sweden, which are where integration doesn't work, of migrants, basically. So from there on, politicians argue that we have to go slow on migration for a while until we get that house in order, so to say. So that's one discourse, which is quite defensive, outsourcing. The second discourse is the one which I'm also involved in. What do we do about Turkey, Syria? What do we do about Libya, Niger, and all that? Where you have these new European instruments. Question: can Europe make a difference now when we don't know what the Americans are going to do? When the Russians are on the move, when the Chinese are becoming more active, and so on? Then many people discuss: do we need to be more of a powerful actor as EU in the world? I hear the new High Representative Borrell in front of the European Parliament talking about Europe as a powerful international player, whereas when I listened to Mogherini recently, she more spoke in terms of assisting, so to say, the neighborhood. And then you come to the third discourse, which is the one that you are now pursuing, namely to avoid mistakes that might hit back at the objectives that we have, and which then link up this vicious circle from creating more domestic policy problems and more populism in Europe, possibly. So I appreciate your effort to try to get a bigger picture and more thought into this to these processes. Niger seems to have become a very interesting case in point. Have you studied that particular case?
Well, Niger is a context which is a case study in our latest report on EU migration controls and their impact on stability in Europe's neighbourhood. And what the case study shows is that from 2015, Niger has been a hotspot for EU interventions on migration. And the EU has tasked its common security and defence policy mission, the EU CAP Sahel Niger, with focusing on irregular migration. And of this, I mean, they'll be played out over the coming few years, but what we've already seen is that Niger has adopted harsh laws against human smuggling under EU pressure, as well as getting security and policing support to help prevent migration. And the government there has used the threat of migration to leverage more funding and political backing from the EU, in spite of the sort of corruption and repression risks that exist. So Niger has become one of the biggest recipients of EU aid per capita in the world, with over €1 billion of development assistance going in from 2014 to 2020. But there's this imbalance in what's being offered. So lots of EU member states are in Niger providing training, providing equipment on the security end. But by contrast, when it comes to the food needs of the population, the World Food Programme could barely raise a third of the funds needed to feed a tenth of Niger's people in 2018. So you see the imbalance. And when there is that inattention to those dynamics of people's needs and the state-society relations, and how giving a lot of security assistance to a government in such a context can skew state-society relations and disempower people, we're worried when we look at contexts like Niger. We're also worried to see that the clampdown on migration there has undermined some of the livelihoods in the context, which often depend on cross-border trade and movement. So in places like Agadez, a vibrant economy becoming shut down, it's become a much more kind of tense security environment, with things getting more and more militarized. So you look at contexts like that and make the observation that the net effect of focusing on migration and things like counterterrorism with a short-term need may be to reinforce issues that could drive significant problems down the road. And the EU, as an actor that has the capability of looking at the big picture, that's not a big picture and a net result that it should favour. So we think that kind of example, and there are others, prompt a rethink on these issues. As you say, it's difficult because there are these quite intense pressures on European politicians domestically to reduce immigration and to think about issues like integration. But I think, a couple of comments there. One thing is that a lot of these pressures seem to stem from concerns about marginalized populations in European countries feeling their access to jobs, their access to services, things like that are being threatened by migration. But sometimes buying into that narrative and the idea that migrants only represent a burden rather than a contribution to European economies can be problematic. What may be useful is for European politicians to focus on alleviating the socio-economic pressures and reinforcing the rights of their populations at home, at the same time as reinforcing the protection and rights of migrants. But another thing is that to say, well, we need to protect Europe from having to adapt to the presence of migrants is looking short-sighted, because if you say, okay, to do that we have to contain migrants in buffer zone countries like Turkey and like Lebanon, that also creates a number of problems in those kind of countries, which in coming years will end up becoming Europe's problems. So the pressure on a country like Lebanon, or of the people in the country being a refugee of one origin or another, those pressures are obviously massive and far outweigh the pressures within Europe and could prove destabilizing in unwanted ways in years to come. Similarly, our report documents that in Turkey, numbers of migrants being contained in the country under the EU-Turkey deal are creating some significant socioeconomic tensions, as well as a range of other impacts. It's understandable why these pressures have worked the way they have in Europe, but to the extent that they're distracting from a bigger picture, Europe's not necessarily helping itself in terms of the way it's responding.
I think maybe at this point it would be useful to say a few words about megatrends, because I spoke to the development aid minister in Sweden the other day about these issues. He just came back from the DRC, and we spoke about the size of the population in that country, where the projection is that it may be 400 million in some decades from now. And we're looking at Nigeria, which might be 700 million people. We're looking at future megacities in Africa, around Lagos and so on. And we're looking at ecology, the climate change. We're looking at 7 children born by each, on the average, by the women in Niger. So the importance of Africa for Europe, which we haven't yet quite understood, I think. We are talking about several billion people, an additional billion people until 2050, possibly. And we have a coastline to Europe, which is something like 10,000 kilometers. From the Canary Islands to up to the northern part of the Greek archipelago. So one would assume, in line with what you are saying, that we have to find a more long-term strategy to create a positive relationship with this continent. But still, we have the problem that we have, of course, important organized crime problems. I mean, we have, even in Sweden, a sizable Nigerian mafia organizing rather brutal human trafficking throughout Europe, starting in Italy. And we have links between different strands of organized crime along the routes that we are mentioning, where the route through Niger is a central one. There is also one along the coast, the Western Sahara coast, and there is one going through a more western route through Sudan, etc. So to find a way to deal with this, not just by repression and negative perceptions of Europeans, certainly would be very important.
I fully agree. I mean, these are some of the sort of massive global issues which are going to have to be handled in coming decades. But, the thought also occurs that, so when we look at these issues like climate change, resource scarcity, growing populations, the risk posed by organized crime, war economies, the rise of transnational violent movements. Again, I come back to a core issue which European leaders today seem at risk of forgetting, which was, clearly understood in the Cold War era, and that's the threat posed by the spread of authoritarianism in Europe's neighbourhood, and the importance of expanding democracy and human rights in the world, because it's only through having functioning, accountable, inclusive political institutions and governing institutions in the context that you're talking about that true partnership approaches to addressing tomorrow's challenges are really going to be possible. Authoritarianism, for all the other issues on the table, is still the number one issue driving instability all around the world today. We know that 99%, and this has been true for years, of terror attacks occurring in the world today occur in conflict-affected and or repressive countries. If you want institutions that can deal in a foresightful and benign way with climate challenges, resource competition, shared water rights, we need to be dealing with governments that are on a stable footing and not using that violence that I mentioned at the beginning as a tool for consolidating their wealth and power, but really seeking to deliver public goods, mediating between the competing interests of different groups, trying to use the rule of law effectively rather than to, use violent movements or criminal networks, as kind of convenient enemies in order to further their interests. So I would really, in response to those trends, still put the issue of governance and finding strategies to transform authoritarianism right at the top of the list for European foreign policy, and gear all efforts towards sort of designing programs and interventions with an eye on how it not so much building the capacity of partner states to govern, but changing the incentives and behaviours of those governments in their approach to how they govern. And nowhere is that more important than in thinking through very carefully these plans to train and equip the security sector of the partner governments that we're talking about, and with an eye on those very big investments being debated even next week between European ambassadors into the security capacities of governments in Europe's neighbourhood. I think that issue of what the impacts that will have on the rise of authoritarianism need to be thought through extremely carefully.
I think this is a very valid comment. In fact, I spent in my own life already, when I wrote my dissertation about military aid as an instrument of influence and power, I found out that the countries providing military aid to others often get a backlash, reap something completely different in the future. Weapons can be used for something quite different than they were intended to be used for initially. And with the introduction of military assistance into the European Peace Facility, Europe needs to be very, very careful going forward, looking at who could be the legitimate recipients of such assistance. We have already had a long-standing relationship with the African Union in the so-called African Peace Facility since 2004, but this is something much more, going beyond train and equip as a concept, which was debated in an extensive public consultation where I believed Saferworld participated in the last years. Getting towards the end of this recording, I just wanted to mention that a good friend of mine, Dunja Mijatovic, who is the Commissioner for Human Rights in the Council of Europe, has recently put out a report with essentially the same message that you just put forward about governance and human rights. A very strong plea to member states of the Council of Europe to try to focus on these issues much more, also in the context of the migration controls.
This is extremely important, and the message from us is not to discourage the EU from engaging in these contexts, but on the contrary, to design that engagement very carefully, to evaluate it more comprehensively, and to gear strategies towards how are they going to change the behavior of security actors. So the message isn't don't touch these issues, but the message is really that we're seeing again and again, we've seen over the years of Western intervention in Afghanistan, in stabilization assistance to Yemen, in the context of Somalia, and in less visible places like Kenya, Tunisia, etc., that if you simply seek to build capacities, assuming that you have a shared political agenda on security with partner regimes and local elites, they will take everything they can get from that engagement, but not necessarily solve the problem. They'll follow their own agenda. So what you have to do when designing security engagement is to think about how to transform the behavior and change the incentives. The West doesn't really have the leverage to do that anymore, particularly not with a range of possible partners offering this kind of assistance. The leverage for the kind of change that we're talking about comes from society in conflict-affected countries. What is possible as an alternative is for actors like the European Union to scale up investment in community security processes. What I mean by that is the kind of programs that work with communities to identify what their security challenges are, to develop plans for addressing them, plans for communities to engage with authorities, and processes where societies can bargain with authorities and with security agencies for better security provision and better justice provision. The West doesn't have the leverage to tell people what to do on human rights. However much security assistance is provided, it won't get that leverage back. But societies do have leverage. This is how change happens, at the interface between societies demanding a better deal and authorities who hopefully have the right incentives responding to that demand. So if Europe wants to influence for change in security governance, it needs a different model for how it does security assistance. So the message isn't don't do this assistance, it's do it differently and monitor, evaluate and learn while you do it.
So, unless you have more to add to this already rather substantial podcast, I want to thank you, Larry, for taking the time to discuss with me. You represent an organization also supported by Sweden, and which is active with an international branch in the UK, working together with the Europe branch in Brussels, an American branch in Washington, and soon I hope something in other places around the globe. So I want to thank you very much for participating in this discussion.
It was an absolute pleasure.